Well, the current contenders weren't given the chance to get too much more complicated than that, but it's a big change, assuming everyone can agree on what socialism means. To try to do that, I'm joined by Tony Benn, the veteran Labour politician, and Mehdi Hasan, the political editor of the New Statesman. Socialism really back in the Labour Party, do you think?
Well, the Labour Party has never been a socialist party, but it's always had socialists in it. And if you take the greatest socialist legislation of my lifetime, the National Health Service, it was also the most popular thing that Labour did, to the point that the government now say they have to protect
Although
it.
Beveridge wasn't a socialist, was he?
Pardon?
Beveridge wasn't a socialist,
Yes,
was he?
but Beveridge wasn't a minister. It was Aaron Bevan and the cabinet that carried the NHS through. And I think every generation has to fight the same battles again and again, because the ideas of socialism go back long before Karl Marx. I mean, the Reverend John Ball at the time of the Peasants' Revolt said things will not go well in England till all things shall be in common, and endless quotations. So I think in that sense it is part of the Labour tradition.
Okay. Do you think socialism, if we can use it with any precision at all, is it coming back in the Labour Party?
Not in the sense you probably think, Jeremy. I mean, look, these are 5 candidates standing for the leadership of the Labour Party, speaking in front of an audience of Labour Party members. It's not surprising that they should choose to define themselves as socialists on that occasion. David Miliband said, you saw in the video, I'm a socialist. And today in The Independent, he says, I'm a modern progressive social democrat. So it depends what label you want to use. These are all very fluid,
but the difference is
labels.
that Blair would have described himself as a social democrat. He very rarely talked about himself as a socialist.
Really, of course, when he ran for Parliament in 1983, he said, I'm a socialist influenced by Karl Marx. Even he knew what he had to do to get elected. Yeah. When he rewrote Clause 4, he kept in the line, we are a democratic socialist party. So everyone recognises the history. Tony's right, Labour's never been a socialist party, but that's an important part of its tradition, especially the whole, the ethos and the history and the cultures and the memories of Attlee, etc., means that you can't just chuck it on the wayside. Not even Tony Blair could get away with doing that.
What do you think being a 21st century socialist in British politics means?
Well, for me, the most revolutionary idea in the world is democracy. When you give everybody the right to have equal civil and political rights, the right to vote and so on. And it's interesting to me, when you take the public expenditure cuts, how unpopular public expenditure is with the present government, because public expenditure is a product of the vote. People who couldn't afford things themselves voted to bring them in by legislation. And that is socialist development. But it's this idea of a perfect socialist society is something which I think is of more theological interest.
I think Tony's right. Of course, many people would have at one time called Tony the high priest of socialism in the Labour Party. And it's interesting that you talk about democracy now, and I agree with you. But when you listen to some of those quotes we just heard, the problem is they're filled with such pieties and platitudes that you wonder, well, who isn't a socialist? Would David Cameron not want to believe in democracy? Would David Cameron not want to believe in solidarity or community? And this coalition goes on about, whether they practice it or not. So it's very worrying when you get definitions that are so wide and so elastic and so loose.
But you be more precise then. What do you really have to believe in to be a 21st century socialist?
Well, again, it depends which view you take. Traditionally, socialism has been identified with, for example, under the old Clause 4, the common ownership of the means of production, distribution and exchange. Well, no one really sticks to that these days. Perhaps Hugo Chavez and some of your gentlemen on the wall might come back and say, well, that's what we want. But none of those 5 candidates, not even Diane Abbott, are advocating that. Even the Attlee government, as you pointed out, were not going the whole hog. They had Beveridge, Keynes as greater influences than Marx and Engels. So it depends what you define it as. I think Herbert Morrison, Peter Mandelson's grandfather, Deputy Prime Minister in that government, he once said it best. He said, socialism is what Labour governments do. It's a very convenient and self-serving definition.
Well, that will do, will it?
No, and I think the ideas of a change in society and a democratic change are very strong. For example, at the moment, major economic power rests not with elected people, but with people like the IMF who are not elected, the bank in Europe is not elected. They're just appointed. The commission in Brussels is appointed. And gradually, I think people see the major decisions taken away from the area of democratic control, and they want it back again.
But in that case, single nation socialism is an absolute waste of time striving for.
Well, that's the Trotskyite argument that, you have to have a socialist world. But I do think that the difference between globalization, where you recognize the legitimacy of these great powers, that are not elected, and internationalism, whereas you work with other people to secure a better world for the world, is, I think, the difference between the socialism of a democratic kind that I believe in and some of the other definitions.
Would you call any of the 5 candidates a socialist, Tony?
Well, I wouldn't presume to comment on their claim. I'm glad they said it, but I mean, everybody, Labour Party is a big club and it has people of different opinions in it, and it always will.
Do you consider any of them a socialist?
I think in terms of ideals and values, if you want to define it in terms of values, then yes, I think they can call themselves social. I think if you're talking in terms of institutions, the organisation of society, the organisation of the economy, then no, they're not socialists in the sense that their predecessors were, or even other leaders like Hugo Chavez in Venezuela is.
It's a noise they have to make in the current circumstances.
I think most definitely.
Thank you both very much indeed. Thank you. In a moment, the papers, but before that, a brief roundup of some of today's news. Our main story tonight, Labour MPs have demanded police reopen the investigation into alleged phone hacking by prominent figures in the news of the world.